Welcome. Well, you're at home with Jim and Joy, and you are an important part of our EWTN family. And we are delighted that you've welcomed us into your home, especially today for this very important conversation. We would love to hear from you, so send us an email with a question or a comment to jimandjoy@ewtn.com. Today, our guest again is Stephanie Gray Connors. She is an author, an international pro-life speaker, an educator, and she's the author of a book that we're sharing about today, Start With What? 10 Principles for Thinking About Assisted Suicide. And this wonderful book is available at ewtnrc.com. And we were sharing with Stephanie yesterday, and we ended up with control. Now, how many of you have issues with control? We all want to be in control. We all want to be in charge. And here we are in 2021, ain't nothing new under the sun, as it was back with Adam and Eve, the book of Genesis, where we all want to be like God. We all want to say, today is a good day for me to die. Today is a good day for me not to welcome the life that I've been blessed with in this unplanned, unexpected pregnancy. However you term it, or death with dignity, euthanasia. And really what we're doing is we've been so infiltrated with the culture of death that we have become like gods. And we think, it's science, we could do this now, we have evolved, we're so great, we're so wonderful. Yeah. And no, we're not. Nothing new under the sun.
Well, let's flip it and say, we have been born for such a time as this.
That's right.
We have been born for this time. The Catholic Church is here for this time. If we would but live what we believe and believe what we say and live it all the way, the sacredness and the dignity of every human person, the gospel of Jesus Christ, His mercy that comes and moves towards us and comes into the darkest places with His open hand that's bleeding to come into these places, but His hand's open. Would you take His hand? Would you take His hand? Would you release control? Would you give Him control? And so Stephanie's going to help us to understand better the Catholic perspective on suffering and pain and end of life. And the great things that can come forth, the beautiful things that can be done if we would just relinquish control. Very important show today. We look forward to speaking with Stephanie in just a moment. We'll be right back. Please don't go away.
Welcome back. We're at home with Jim and Joy, and as I promised, our guest today is Stephanie Gray Connors. She is an author, international pro-life speaker, and educator. And if you haven't heard her, you're in for a great treat. She's the author of a great book called Start With What? 10 Principles for Thinking About Assisted Suicide. And this great book is available at ewtnrc.com. You could go to her website, loveunleasheslife.com. So, Stephanie, you know, we were talking about control, faith, how we're processing all this, and it's all really about perspective. So share with our family about perspective through suffering, through assisted suicide.
Yes, perspective is so important. And, you know, there's that classic question, if you see a glass of water and someone says, is it half full or is it half empty? And it's all about the perspective that you take as you look at that. You could look at the negative angle of, oh, yeah, there's half of it gone. Or the more positive angle of, oh, there's still half a glass of water left. And so in the same way, when we suffer, I think we need to really realize what we do have control of is how we view the situation. And a classic example that I often raise with audiences that really uses an analogy to make the point clear is to imagine you are walking down the road and you see across the street an elderly lady who clearly has come from the grocery store and she's holding lots of bags of groceries. They look really heavy. She looks frail, looks like she's going to drop several of them. As you observe this, is your first response to think, wow, that woman is a burden? Or is your first response to think, wow, those groceries are a burden. Those heavy bags are a burden. And I think we all know our response is going to be that second scenario. Once we identify the groceries as the burden, what do? We cross the road, we approach the old woman, and we say, may I help you? Can I carry some of your bags? Would you like to hold on to my elbow? And so what we realize is that the woman isn't the burden, but she's been saddled with a burden of heavy groceries. And when we care about our fellow humans, what we want to do when they're burdened is lighten the load. And I bring that up because when it comes to assisted suicide and suffering, all too often people misidentify what the burden is. They will look at someone who's disabled and say that person's the burden. Someone who's elderly, they're the burden. Someone who's sick, that person's the burden. But actually, it's not the individual. It's the sickness, it's the disability, it's the age. Those are the burdens that the individual's been saddled with. And instead of making our perspective be the person is the burden, we want to shift it to the experience they're facing is the burden, so that it causes us to, as we talked in the last episode, unleash love.
Yes.
And lighten the load for them and spend time with them and give them attention and love and care. So it's all about changing the perspective from the individual being the burden to what they're facing being burdensome.
Yeah, and you're speaking about that as to us observing other people, friends, family, just other people, and identifying what the real burden is, not the person, but what they're carrying with them at this time. But we hear a lot of people themselves saying, we hear this with people as they're moving on in years, I don't ever want to be a burden. So what does that lead to? And we hear this again and again and again. How could we address that with our aging family members or parents or those that are facing some kind of physical crisis or whatever it might be? And they're speaking this language of exiting, and I still want to be able to do something. I don't feel like I could do anything. And what I want to do is take the burden off of you. And we try to say, Mom, you're not a burden. And so how do we deal with not only our bad perspective and kind of helping to facilitate this exiting options, and people, because we may have more time with this person or work with them, because sometimes they say it for years, and to attack this false philosophy, this false theology and thinking, I don't want to be a burden to you.
Yeah, I think, one of the things to do in that situation is to ask them why they feel that way and how they would respond if the tables were turned and we felt like a burden on them, especially if we're their child. And so we could say, Mom or Grandma, think about when I was an infant. If I could have spoken and voiced, I don't want to be a burden on you, which in a sense, someone could say an infant is in the middle of the night when the baby cries and they don't want to get up and it feels like a burden to respond to the child's cries. They would likely reply, as hard as it was, as difficult as it was worth it because I love you and I loved being in relationship with you, even in those difficult times. So then we can point out this is an amazing opportunity to pay back to the person who loved us when we were in a vulnerable state, to love them in a very particular way when they're in a vulnerable state, or to pay it forward. If it's not a relative, but it's someone in church who doesn't have family. And they express that they feel like they're a burden. For us to say, there was a time when I was really vulnerable and dependent, and I'm thriving because of the people who took care of me.
Yes.
It would be an honor for me to pay it forward and be able to take care of you so that you can thrive. I can never give back. For example, none of us can pay back to our mothers the sacrifice and our fathers that they made for us, but we can pay it forward to our offspring, to our other family members, or to people who become friends.
Yes. Well, excellent. And this is why your book's so important, not only the arguments you make, but how you make them and methodology in speaking with people. So a lot of us, when we hear somebody saying, well, I don't want to be a burden, it'd be like, Ma, stop, I love you.
Right.
But you're saying, no, ask her. Get it out of her. Why do you feel the way you feel? I want to hear from you, Ma. Whoever it is, I want to know, why do you feel that way? And then kind of turn the tables, Ma, Ma, or whoever, didn't you take care of me? Didn't you do this and that? And what a blessing it was for you. What a blessing it is for me. Of course, that's what I would do. I would do that for you and for our other family members or people that I love. Ma, that's what we're saying. We want to do this for you. You give us opportunity to love you. That's great. So your methodology, as well as your arguments, are just fantastic. Tell us about Dr. Paul Brand. He's somebody you mentioned in your book and his work with lepers and so on. How does this fit with the whole topic that you're bringing before us?
Yes, I've been so moved by the work of that doctor who lived in the last century, and he went to India and worked with leprosy patients. He actually co-authored a book called The Gift of Pain. And if you think about it, I mean, when we're in pain, we usually want to get out of it. How could you ever call that a gift? But what he realized in working with leprosy patients who were basically people who could not feel pain, and as a result of not feeling pain, they would unwittingly do self-destructive things to their limbs without realizing it, because pain never told them to
Right.
stop, that then caused their bodies to decay and so forth. And so he tells a powerful story in his book of how he, as a physician, was a hand surgeon. So what he would do is he would often repair the stumps and the wounded hands of leprosy patients to make them more functional. And so he did this for one of his patients. I believe his name was John. And the patient left, went back to his village, and then he returned to Dr. Brand. And he comes with these hands that, from a surgeon's perspective, look fantastic, that Dr. Brand was so proud of. But the patient looks at Dr. Brand and says, "Doctor, these hands are no good." And the doctor's looking at him like, "What do you mean? I've repaired your hands." And the patient said, "You might have fixed my hands, but you didn't fix my nose." And often leprosy patients had sunken noses. "You didn't replace my eyebrows. I have no eyebrows." And his point was that because he still looked like a leper with the sunken nose and the lack of eyebrows, he couldn't get work. No one would hire him. So he needed to continue to beg. But because his hands looked good, he couldn't beg and make as much money begging as he did before the surgery. And so I bring this story up in my book in order to make the point. If Dr. Brand had responded to the patient by saying, "You're right, let me maim your hands, let me disfigure them again so that you can better beg," we would consider that medical malpractice. We would say that that doctor would have failed in addressing the patient's underlying problem. So Dr. Brand didn't do that. Instead, he got creative, shifted from just hand surgery, and he actually started doing nose reconstructive surgery. He actually would cut hair from the scalp and transplant it above the eyes so leprosy patients could regrow eyebrows. And he improved this patient's life overall so that he no longer looked like a leper. He didn't pass on leprosy because it wasn't contagious in that way. And he was able to thrive in society. And so my point is that Dr. Brand heard what the patient was not verbalizing. When he said, "These are not good hands," what he was really communicating was, "My problem is bigger than my hands." And the doctor heard that, and then he made a holistic response, improving the patient's life. So in the same way, when someone comes to their doctor and says, "I want to die," what they're actually communicating but not verbalizing is, "I'm hurting in some way. I'm in pain. I feel like a burden. I feel useless." And instead of just offering someone assisted suicide when they say they want to die, we want to hear what they really mean and then make a holistic approach so as to give them the supports they need, make them feel like they're part of a network, supported, loved, and so forth. And then we really help people thrive.
Well, how do we respond when people say that they should be allowed assisted suicide, that it is my body, it's my life, and what I'm about to do isn't going to affect anyone anyway?
Yes, when people say that, what comes to mind is the classic poem by John Donne, "No Man is an Island." And so if someone says they feel that their death would have no impact on others, I would say, is that how we feel when someone commits suicide? Whether it's famous people like Robin Williams or Kate Spade, who in the last several years ended their lives, their loved ones, the people who didn't even know them, would talk about the loss of those individuals, not only from society, but their absence impacting those of us in society who are left behind. The fact that where you have suicide, you have an increase in other suicides shows that our actions and our absence affects others. I think of there's a powerful story of a young girl. People can Google her. Her name is Zuli Sanguino. She's from, I believe, Colombia. She was born without arms and legs and faced a lot of suffering in her life. When she was 2, her dad committed suicide. She herself was sexually assaulted. She was bullied for being so physically different. And all this culminated in her as a teenager thinking about ending her life. Thankfully, she didn't. Now she's a motivational speaker. She's a beautiful artist. There's videos of her online. And because she's overcome so much, her story has been aired on multiple media stations in Latin America. Now, there was a young man who was going through his own difficult time, and he was so despairing that he had a gun and he was going to kill himself. But the day that he had kind of locked himself in a room with his gun, he put the TV on, and the TV happened to be airing an interview with Zuli, where she talked about all the suffering she faced and how she didn't give up on life. This young man was so inspired by her witness that he put the gun down, picked up a pen and paper, wrote her, and they've become friends. Now, I bring that up to say, if someone were to say, if I kill myself, it has no impact on others, the story of Zuli is proof that that claim is wrong. Because if she had killed herself at 15, she never would have had a story of overcoming suffering that would have been aired on TV at a pivotal moment when someone else was going to end his life. Had he never encountered Zuli, he might have ended his life. And so it was because the very reason that she held on to her life was that it didn't just impact her. It impacted that young man and countless others who have come across her story. So the reality is our presence or our absence impacts people.
Well, address the question that always comes up with people and maybe even believing people, how does God allow? Why does he tolerate this kind of suffering? What kind of God does this? How do I find meaning in a God like this? How do you address that?
Yes, that's a great question. And it is always hard when we know God is all loving and God is all powerful, why he wouldn't immediately stop the suffering that we face. And what I have had to come to terms with in my own journey and the journey of others who I've asked to share their stories with me is to remember the words of Peter, who in John chapter 6, when Jesus was talking about being the bread of life, and this was so confusing to people. What? We have to gnaw on your flesh? We have to consume you as food? People started walking away. This was such a startling teaching. And so Jesus looked at Peter and said, will you also go away? And he said, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And I think when we face suffering that we can't explain, we have a few options. One option is to say, well, clearly God doesn't exist. How happy are we going to be living in a world where we've made ourselves God and claim to believe there isn't a higher power? The other alternative is to run to another higher power and say, okay, well, then Satan's going to do things for me. And that's just a recipe for, total torture and misery. The third option is to say, I am human. I don't know it all. I am like a cross stitch. I'm like looking at a cross stitch. I see the back where it's messy. God sees the other side that says home sweet home. And because I don't fully grasp things as a human, and because God is a God and not a human, although as Jesus, he experienced humanity, then I have to trust, as a child trusts their parents, that when things are confusing and don't make sense, he is working all things for good. I'll use the analogy for people. If a child asks their parent for chocolate and the parent denies the child's going to think the parent is being mean. Why, if you love me, why wouldn't you give me the candy? But the parent might know something the child doesn't know, that the child will have an anaphylactic reaction because they have an allergy, or because they want to surprise the child later and make them even more happy with chocolate at a deferred time. The point is, we trust the goodness of the parent. And so we have to trust that God created a world without sin, and he's preparing a world to come where there are no more tears, as the book of Revelation tells us.
Stephanie, we just have a couple of minutes left, and I want you to address our EWTN family. Maybe there's somebody that's in a predicament, in a situation, physically, emotionally, psychologically, otherwise, where they're contemplating assisted suicide or taking their own lives. Maybe there's someone who has this philosophy and theology, which we embrace, of meaning and hope and eternal life, and yet they find themselves in this situation where they're kind of losing this hope. Can you speak a word to them or those who care about them and give them hope?
Yes, to know first of all that if you exist because God willed you into existence. That what might be an accident from a human perspective is always intentional from God's perspective when it comes to new life that is made in his image. So if you are here for a mighty purpose to love and be loved. And I think we've mentioned in the last episode Dr. Frankl, and one of his great quotes is the more one forgets himself by giving himself to a cause to serve or a person to love, the more human he is. And if you look for someone who's in need around you, someone who's in crisis around you, and you seek to help them, you are going to find yourself fulfilled. You're going to find yourself having hope. The other thing is to realize we're never alone. You know, when my husband and I lost our first child to miscarriage, a dear friend wrote us a letter, and she said, "I'm praying that your heart does not grow bitter towards the Lord." And we were given a grace to not be bitter. I even had told God before I got pregnant, I only want to get pregnant if I don't have a miscarriage. Don't ever let me lose a child. Well, I got pregnant and I had a miscarriage.
Yes.
But what surprised me was that my heart hadn't grown bitter. And the friend shared a beautiful quote by Elizabeth Elliot, a Christian missionary, who said, "The secret is Christ in me, not me in a different set of circumstances." And so to remember that we're never alone. Christ is with us in our bodies and gives us his body, and that he will give us the strength to endure whatever we have to face, just as he had the strength to endure that.
Yes. Stephanie, thank you so much for the gift of this book, Start With What. Thank you for the gift of your own life. Thank you for your storytelling and for your own personal witness. May many be blessed through it. God bless you. Thank you so much for this gift.
Thank you.
You can go to loveunleasheslife.com, loveunleasheslife.com, or go to ytsync-en and purchase the book, Start With What. We'll be right back. There's plenty more to come. Please don't go away.
Welcome back. Well, what a wonderful conversation and time we had with Stephanie. We encourage you to go out to ytsync-en and get that book. You know, what we think of is in our times of suffering, we're always going to respond. And sometimes God offends our minds to reveal our hearts. And it's like, well, like what Stephanie shared, well, Lord, I don't want to get pregnant if I'm going to have a miscarriage, or I don't want this to happen if this is going to happen. And you know what? It doesn't always work that way. And that's where, you know, we've had miscarriages in our family. We've had to weep with our children over their pregnancy losses. It's devastating. And there are other things in life that you think, that's going to take me out. But we always have a time to respond in faith, in hope, in trust. And you know what? That's where we get to work our Catholic faith. That's where you go into adoration and you cry out to Jesus. That's where you go to confession and you say, this is my response to this. I'm feeling hopeless. I'm angry with God. I'm angry about this situation. I'm angry with these people, whatever it is, so that your heart would then be pure and holy. And so that when something happens, you're going to filter everything through your faith. And God is about making you more and more like him. And it's in marriage, it's in relationships, it's in life circumstances that he's trying to make you holy. So then we can say, okay, God, what is my response to this? And I pray that it would be what God would have you to be.
God knows. Take hold of him. Take hold of that bleeding hand that's coming to you in the midst of this unbelievable situation that you're in, and let him save you. Save you again, convert you again to himself. Say, Lord, even if you slay me, I will love you, but I will not slay myself. I won't slay anybody else, Lord. I feel like I'm slain already. But Lord, I want to radically take hold of you. As St. Paul took hold of the Lord, he said, you took hold of me. Now I'm taking hold of you. What do you want? Don't say why. Say what? What do you want with me? What do you want with this situation, Lord? What? And God will bring something beautiful out of the midst of this darkness and this death and this crisis, and he will leave you a blessing and life that may go generations yet to come. You're an important part of this EWTN family. You are never alone. And you're always at home with Jim and with Joy. God bless you, and God bless all of your loved ones living and with him. Bye now.